Ever since his incarnation into the physical world, Griffith has been going hard on his agenda of world domination. He's found success wherever he's gone, primarily because of his army of war demons. Since he's a god hand that now walks within the confines of the physical world, his mere presence is like a beacon of shining light to apostles everywhere. They flock to his light to pledge their loyalty and lives to him because, number one, he was their natural master, and number two, this was all part of the story he was writing for himself. But there is one apostle in his army that joined because he can't wait for the opportunity to kill Griffith, and as causality would have it, he's the only one that has a name reflective of his nature. Rakshas is one of Griffith's most unnerving war demons, as you'll learn by the end of this video, and a lot of that is tied to his anatomy as an apostle. So without further ado, let's dive right into Rakshas. Who is Rakshas? How did he become an apostle? Rakshas debuts in chapter 184 of Berserk in the middle of Griffith's first offensive to recapture Midland territory. At the height of the battle for Shet, as Zod and Locust were making short work of the Kushan forces gathered, the Bakiraka prince Salat saw an opportunity to fulfill his mission and nab the Falcon of Light while his guard was down. His Tapasa leapt towards Griffith with the intention of taking him off his horse, but they didn't even get close. They're knocked down mid-air by a blob of black rags, which is shocking because the Tapasa are extremely durable dudes. Just a couple of chapters prior, they smashed multiple Midland Knights to death with their bare hands, and those guys were in armor. The Tapasa's skin is so hard and dense that they can deflect incoming blades with their fists, so you can imagine what their entire body would be capable of. And yet, Rakshas managed to knock them back like they were novices, and not only that, he proceeded to diss them for being slow and obtuse. As he mockingly bemoans how the supposed summit of the Bakiraka clan has fallen, he takes his proper form, and it's his mask that gives away his identity. A three-eyed mask with a third eye dripping 2 drops of blood and fangs adorning the base. The Tapasa and the young master of the Bakiraka were unlikely to forget their clan's exile. The question then became why he was here at Shet, which Rakshas himself answers by addressing Griffith directly. Apparently, he was drawn here by the Falcon's rebirth, and having taken in his beauty, Rakshas promises that one day he will be the one to take Griffith's head. But until that day, he would follow him as his soldier, and to prove his loyalty, he engages the Bakiraka unit in direct combat, keeping all 5 of them occupied. Once Shet is secured, Rakshas is made the captain of Griffith's search and destroy unit, and he takes special joy in his new duty. But this isn't only because of his nature as an apostle. Rakshas loved the act of killing long before he became a demonic reincarnate. Having been a member of the Bakiraka clan, it's safe to assume that Rakshas was trained in the same fighting styles, using the same weapons as the Tapasa and Salat. As a tribe of assassins, killing was how the Bakiraka earned a living, but they took no joy in it. Originally, they were a warrior clan that protected the previous Kushan royal family before it was deposed by Ganishka. But since being driven from their homeland, they've had to resort to assassination as a means of living, because that's what their specific skills were best suited for. Even though taking a life is the bread and butter of the Bakiraka, the clan always emphasizes duty over self-satisfaction. To them, an assassin is one who administers death, not one who toys with it, and Rakshas was the latter kind of person. He was one of the best assassins in his clan, but his obsession with toying with his targets and deriving pleasure from their deaths went against every tenet held sacred by the Bakiraka. Salat names him Thrill Killer and acknowledges that he might have been born to kill, but that didn't make him a man worthy of being an assassin. It was because Rakshas liked indulging his habit of playing with his target that he was exiled from the Bakiraka clan in the first place. He must have been out of sight, out of mind for Salat, because the young master was shocked to see Rakshas at Shet, but he, like every other apostle that showed up that day, had been guided there by the current of causality. As for how Rakshas became an apostle in the first place, we don't know the exact circumstances, but we can venture a guess. Given his obsession with killing and his particular set of skills, it's likely that he was toying with a target that he shouldn't have messed with in the first place, and when Rakshas let his guard down, the tables were turned on him. Turns out, even a guy like him had someone who loved him, because just as he was dying, he activated his Behelit. This summoned the God Hand, who granted him his desire to continue living as the apex predator of his species in exchange for a sacrifice. Giving Rakshas his nature, we're sure he didn't even think twice before accepting that deal, and once it was struck, his sights were set upon the ultimate target, Griffith himself. Rakshas, being an apostle, was enthralled by the Falcon of Light instinctively, given his nature, and that is part of the reason why he wants to kill him. He hates the fact that he has such deep emotions for a man that he wants to murder, when usually that sort of thing is reserved for himself. himself, but he also knows that launching a sneak attack on the Falcon is futile, because he'd just make him kneel without even lifting a finger. That's how it was for an apostle that dared to defy a God Hand member. So instead, he plays nice with Griffith and leads his War Demon Search and Destroy unit, which is a glorified term for an insanely macabre cleanup crew. In chapter 193, after forcing the Kushan troops at Shet into a retreat, the Falcon sends Rakshas' unit after them to make sure that none survive. The apostle corners the withdrawing Kushan general with his troops and stops their advance because he and his men hadn't seen blood yet. Brutalizing enemy remnants isn't the only part of his job description, as Rakshas' unit is also given the duty of protecting Griffith from the shadows. In chapter 195, shortly after their defeat, the Kushan try to assassinate Griffith using Baki Raka scouts, but Rakshas beats them to the punch and kills them all before a single arrow can be loosed. Clearly, his strength and stealth are unmatched because most of his enemies have never even seen him coming. But what makes him even more interesting to us is his physiology, because Rakshas is one of those rare apostles that doesn't have a humanoid state. Why is Rakshas' apostle form so different from others? Does he even have a body? Now, most apostles in Berserk have humanoid base forms that allow them to operate within society freely. That's how they go unnoticed for the most part, until it's feeding or killing time. But occasionally, there will pop up an apostle whose base form itself will be far from humanoid, and such apostles usually turn out to be extremely powerful. The first such apostle we saw was Rosine, who looked like an elf in her base state and a gigantic Luna moth in her release state. She was powerful enough to create two separate armies of pseudo-apostles and terrorize the entire region surrounding the Misty Valley, all by her lonesome. Guts had to burn down a forest and risk being impaled at the speed of sound in order to defeat her. The second was the Egg of the Perfect World, who, albeit weak by himself, had done way more damage to the world than anyone can truly comprehend simply with his actions. He turned several people into pseudo-apostles in the lead up to the incarnation ceremony, and his speed was such that he outpaced Skull Knight twice. In the end, the Egg was used as a vessel for Griffith's emergence, but Rakshas is unlike either of these apostles. For starters, both the Egg and Rosine had tangible bodies that were susceptible to very real damage. Rakshas, on the other hand, seems to be exactly what we called him at the beginning of the previous segment, a gigantic ball of rags. Turns out, this apostle's power is shapeshifting, and we get a taste of it in his first proper engagement with the Tapasa, where he weaves through their limbs to fight both of them at the same time without any difficulty. It's like he's one continuous cloak with the outlines of a head, shoulder, and arms, and the reason for that is Rakshas is essentially a shapeshifter. Moreover, both the Egg and Rosine shared their power with other people as opposed to hoarding it all for themselves, which Rakshas does. It's possible that neither of them knew how to draw out the full potential of their abilities, considering they were both pretty much unaware that they were being used as pawns. But Rakshas has a clear idea of who he was and what he wanted to be. The secret behind his ability lies in his name, because unlike the rest of the war demons, Miura actually named this guy after a real-life demon, or at least a category of demons. Rakshasas are a species of being from Hindu mythology that are mostly associated with evil and possess powers of illusion, shapeshifting, and more. They use these powers to interrupt sacrifices, kidnap women, eat humans, and just generally make life a living hell for those who have the misfortune of falling into their traps. Some Rakshasas can be good, but most of them are opportunistic cannibals, so it's hard to go to bat for them, you know? Anyways, the word Rakshasa has become associated with English in modern Hindi, so technically, Griffith has a war demon captain whose name is Demon. That man is just the height of subtlety. I'm not surprised people can't figure out that he's a demon. Anyways, Berserk's Rakshas cannot use illusions to take on different forms or trick people into following him into different places, but he can shapeshift with the fluidity of flowing water, and that alone makes him an extremely dangerous opponent. Being amorphous means he can extend his body as much as he wants to, and while you might not be able to hit him, he can get you very easily with his mini daggers that he pulls from out of his cloak body when the time is ripe. If that wasn't enough, he can wrap his limbs around you and choke you out. And not having to bother with leg muscles means that his natural speed is far greater than you'd think it'd be. Whenever Rakshas needs to move at high speeds, he takes on a streamlined form, which allows him to move from point A to point B at a blinding pace. The fact that his body cloak is all black doesn't help his enemies, and neither does the fact that his mask is his only visible feature. That mask and the three glowing eyes which shine through its openings are the only indicators that he even has a body. Whenever he gets caught by his enemies, Rakshas simply cuts his captured limbs off and they turn into old rags in their hands. His power of shapeshifting is both an offensive and defensive measure. But that brings us to our next question. Does Rakshas's mask have any significance? Is it connected to his powers? Throughout Berserk, we rarely see Rakshas without his mask on. It's how Salat figures out the apostle that repelled his mighty Bakiraka used to be a clansman in chapter 184. The use of a mask by an assassin isn't a new practice, and it was likely part of Rakshas's attire or his calling card back in the day as a human. Now that he's an apostle, the mask seemingly serves as an anchor point for his personality, because not only does he wear it at all times, he's also terribly attached to it. Rakshas's first mask actually breaks during a fight with Salat, which we'll address in a moment, and he's so dejected by it that he calls off the whole thing and sulks his way back to the Falcon's palace. When he returns for their rematch, he's sporting a brand new mask, but still lamenting the loss of his favorite. These masks don't seem to serve any real purpose when it comes to his shape-shifting abilities. Maybe you can say that they're an outlet for his 3 eyes, which is a distinct feature of his mask, but that's about it. But from a design standpoint, Rakshas's mask indicates his changing loyalties. The first mask he has on looks a lot like a Rakshas mask from southern India, plus the 3rd eye opening. But the second mask he wears has avian-themed details all over it. The eye openings gain feathers and wings, and so do those drops of blood that were a part of his first mask's design. The drops multiply in number as well, for where there used to be 2 on the first mask, the second mask has 3. Perhaps this is how he indicates that it's his 3rd mask. He had 1 as a human serial killer, 1 as an apostle, and now that one's been broken, 1 as a servant of Griffith. But as we said before, the masks don't necessarily do anything other than serving an aesthetic purpose and being something that Rakshas is unnaturally attached to. Well, actually, now that we're thinking about it, they do serve one purpose when it comes to Rakshas's power. They help him hide his biggest secret. Why killing Rakshas is almost impossible. How he controls his anatomy. Most apostles have physical bodies that are inspired by some sort of creation that already exists in nature or myth, and sometimes a combination of both. But what's common for them is the fact that they can only control their physiology up to the point of transforming into their released states. Sure, there's lots of apostles that can extend their limbs and produce more of them when in a pinch, but they cannot move around their hearts and brains like Muzan can, for instance. If you guys want to know more about who he is and why that's relevant, check out our Muzan anatomy video. The main reason is the fact that the Demon King's immortality stems from his multiple organs which he can move around freely inside of himself, which means that you have to take out all of his hearts and brains before you can put him down for good. One way to circumvent this is to have an intangible release state, like Emperor Ganishka's Thundercloud form. But if you've seen our breakdown of his anatomy or his Shiva form, you'll know that the Dread Emperor's seemingly unbeatable release state actually had some glaring weaknesses, the one being that a sufficiently powerful gust of wind could pull him out of it at any moment. Moreover, if a magic user was able to locate his ethereal body in amongst his Thundercloud form, then they would be able to defeat him using a weapon like Dragon Slayer, if they can withstand his lightning, that is. Rakshas doesn't have these problems because he can control the entire area of his body however he wants to. The Shapeshifter Apostle is named such not only because he can make his way around pretty much everything in this world and trap it if it's weak enough, he's called that because within the space that he expands his body to, he can move his organs freely, thus keeping his enemies confused at all times. This is where his mask becomes a part of his power, because it usually tricks people into thinking that that's where his head is. But as Rakshas explains to Salat in his Tapasa in chapter 389, that wasn't necessarily the case. In that chapter, Rakshas tries to kill Rickard after he slaps Griffith in front of everyone of importance within Falconia. Whether he does this of his own free will, or whether he's ordered to do so, we don't know. What we do know is that he manages to corner Rickard at the edge of the city, and had Salat and his Tapasa not been tracking the lad, he'd have likely died right then. The Bakiraka prince and his men engaged Rakshas, with Salat using projectiles and his Tapasa getting up close and personal with him. But the apostle displays his clear superiority over them, which stems from his shape-shifting abilities. When Salat fires off his chakram towards Rakshas, the apostle stuffs himself into a hole created by a collapsed mirror, baiting the Tapasa into attacking him directly. He then grabs them both, but gets stretched out by them so Salat can run his Katara through the exile's face. But as soon as that happens, Rakshas emerges from the base of his cape, still safe and in one piece. The Tapasa maintain their grip on his hands because although they're holding the husk of his previous body, it was still tied to his new body. Rakshas remedies that real quick by chopping off his own arms and letting everyone know that he could pretty much move his body anywhere within the surface of his cloak. Since the only way to kill an apostle for sure is to go for the head, Rakshas constantly moves his head around so no no one can touch him. This makes him one of Griffith's trickiest war demons to deal with, because while he might not have the strength of Zod, Grunbeld, Locus, or Irvine, persistence was Rakshas's department. With his shapeshifting powers, killing him is next to impossible for someone that isn't an elite warrior, and most of those are already on Griffith's side these days. You could try to capture him and twist him a million different ways in an attempt to finally kill him, but all of those ways would turn out to be bust, and then you die a slow, agonizing death at the hands of the most sadistic apostle. This death can also come out of nowhere at the moment you least expect it, because if shapeshifting and an autonomous head wasn't enough, Rakshas also has the perfect stealth mechanism ingrained in his body. Can Rakshas manipulate shadows? How powerful is his release state? This ability of his didn't become evident until the climactic moment of the Millennium Falcon arc, but Rakshas is one of the most unique apostles in existence because he can blend with his environment to unleash his attacks. And we don't mean blend like a chameleon, we mean blend, like literally blend with it. When Griffith flew Zod up to the head of Emperor Ganishka in an effort to set in motion his new world order, he brought with him an unseen specter, Rakshas. Turns out, the apostle had hidden himself in the shadows of one of Zod's wings, and the Immortal One seemed unaware of his presence because he didn't react to it like he usually would to being caught off guard. The Bakiraka exile witnesses everything that happens at ground zero of the great roar of the astral world, and there could be a few reasons for his presence there. The first being his pledge to kill Griffith one day. It might seem like a character quirk to you, but Rakshas takes killing so personally that he got banished from his clan for it. When he says he wants to kill Griffith, especially because of the way he enthralls him, then you best believe he means it. Maybe he figured that the moment his interim master makes his move to solve the Shiva problem, his guard would be low enough for Rakshas to swoop in and fulfill his desire. Or it could be that he was gathering as much intel as he could before making his move, because as an apostle, he knew just how impossible a task like killing a god hand could be. He knows a lot more about the inner workings of the astral world, as demonstrated by his knowledge of how Daiba's man-made Behelit works, so it could just be that he wanted to see what his odds would be like before making a definitive move. But all that changed when Skull Knight showed up from out of nowhere and did what we thought Rakshas was going to do. Still, for him to not get a reaction from any of the three people that were gathered there is a testament to how well he can use shadows to conceal his presence, and that isn't all. Being able to melt into the shadows also allows Rakshas to use them to his advantage, though unlike members of the Nara clan from Naruto, he cannot control them. Rakshas uses shadows as a medium, diving into them, going wherever he pleases, and then exiting. It's like the world's fastest cab service minus the fee, because only Rakshas can do it. That isn't the only way that this ability can be used, however, because it also has great applications in warfare, particularly ambushing and assassination. In his skirmish with Salat and the Tapasa in chapter 339, Rakshas repeatedly uses shadows to give himself an advantage over his enemies. In the chapter before that, he managed to cover a distance of at least 10 to 20 meters in the blink of an eye, reaching Rickert before he could even react. If you pay close attention to the panels, Rakshas leverages the shadow of the statue he was perched upon to boost his speed. Later, he manages to catch the Tapasa off guard by grabbing their feet from within their shadows and then coiling his limbs up to their torsos. This sneak attack would have been lethal against any opponent lesser than the Tapasa, and Rakshas knows it. While he can do all this cool stuff with shadows, he cannot directly manipulate them into things like projectiles or needles. He can only use them while continuing to function within the scope of his physical limitations. The fact that he has no limitations is a separate issue, of course. He operates best at night because that's when shadows are at their most potent, and we haven't even properly spoken about his release state yet. Rakshas's released form isn't all that special when compared to many other apostles' released forms, but it makes perfect sense for him. In this form, he becomes massive, and he can utilize every inch of his body to do pretty much whatever he wants to. Rakshas can fly without the use of wings. We saw him spook a bunch of Ganishka's war elephants by floating close to their heads and injecting them with poison darts in chapter 280, but in his released form, he can manifest hundreds of bat wings and not just levitate, but fly. Rakshas can reach the same heights as Daiba's Garudas when he takes off, and he isn't even supposed to be a flight type apostle. He's only the second one after Zod who gains such a transformation boost with his release state, and it has more applications besides flight. If Rakshas wanted to, he could project hundreds of limbs from his being, which he would then employ for battle or capture, whichever was the need of the hour. The versatility of his battle style would be increased multiple times over, especially now that he has a lot more surface area to move his vitals around in. The reason we only focus on him flying is because that's the only thing we've seen him do in his release state, and the reason behind that is Rakshas's weakness. What is Rakshas's weakness? How is he finally defeated? Darkness can only be defeated by one thing in this world: light. A shadow only exists because of a feeble light, it's true, but the brighter that light burns, the feebler the shadow becomes until it ceases to exist altogether. For someone that always lurks within the shadows, it makes sense that Rakshas's weakness would be light, and not just any light, we're talking about the light that accompanies flame. Fire is Rakshas's greatest weakness because in the presence of the brightness and the heat, the scope of his movement becomes greatly restricted. This is evidenced by his final encounter with Salat, where the Bakiraka prince handily outmaneuvers the demonic exile. Salat even manages to counter Rakshas's face fake-out and slice his real face with the blade he holds between his toes. This draws rare praise from the apostle for the Bakiraka prince's skills, which he acknowledges could not have been achieved without hard labor. Their duel was fought inside a ring of firecrackers, and Salat managed to land that hit just before they went out. Rakshas was confident that once darkness consumed all, he would make quick work of everyone gathered, especially Rickard, but that's when he gets blasted with Big Rick's massive flamethrower. Turns out, Rickard had converted one of the ancient fire extinguishers he found during his time in Falconia and tuned it up to create a medieval flamethrower, which is the second coolest thing he had done up until that point. Right behind slapping the shit out of Griffith, of course, Rakshas began panicking hard as soon as the flames hit his body. He was flying all over the place looking for a way to douse the flames because otherwise he'd have likely died. He kills a horse and uses its blood to save himself and then kidnaps Erica to try to turn the situation in his favor. His plan works, at least until Daiba involves himself and swarms him with several snakes whose venoms make Rakshas writhe in pain. Because he's an apostle, he's able to brush it off and give chase to his targets. But that's when Big Rick pulls out the Blamizuka and blasts Rakshas right in the face. The explosion that follows is witnessed by all of Falconia, and the Shadow Apostle hasn't been seen in the series since. Most presume he will return, but we wouldn't be surprised if Rickard actually managed to kill him with that blast, considering Guts has done the same to countless apostles with his arm cannon. Still, if he does return, we would love to see how he gets to Griffith now that all of his strengths and weaknesses have been brought out of the shadows. Marvelous verdict! As for the actual anatomy of Rakshas, we're afraid that's all we have for you guys. He was one of the more interesting war demons in Griffith's army simply because his goals weren't to impress his master, unlike Locus and Grunbeld. Rakshas truly joined Griffith's army just so he could have the first crack at killing him, and in a lot of ways, that makes him similar to Zod, who himself was recruited to the reborn band of the Falcon because Griffith defeated him. But that's enough talk from us. What do you guys think? How did you like Rakshas? Do you think he has any chance of killing Griffith? Let us know in the comments down below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Till then, keep struggling, strugglers.